I'm Michael Dannenberg. I'm the founder of the New America Foundation's Education Policy Program and its influential blog, Higher Ed Watch. I'm also a senior fellow at the foundation and will be speaking and moderating our next panel on higher education. Bonnie Reese was going to join us. She's a regent with the University of California system and a former senior advisor to Governor Schwarzenegger, and she will not be able to join us, unfortunately, due to a serious illness in her family, I believe. But we are fortunate enough to also be joined by Pat Callan, who's the founder and director of the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, and one of the best minds in the nation when it comes to thinking about higher education policy from the state level as well as nationally. I'm going to begin with a series of comments. I'll try and make 4 key points. I'll turn over the mic to Pat, and then he and I will both head up to the podium, excuse me, up to the staging area for a Q&A period and discussion. We'll try and keep this relatively brief. I said I wanted to make 4 key points in my remarks. For those taking notes, I'll make it easy by telling you the 4 key points right up front, and then discuss them. The first is that the federal and state investment in higher education has changed dramatically over the last 30 years, and I think may be about to change again very dramatically. We've gone from a system of public investment to private responsibility. The second point I want to make is that the stimulus represents a marked increase in the federal investment in higher education and may trigger a lasting shift in state investment in higher education as well. Third is that as we think about this increased investment, there are a number of options in how to direct that money, how to spend it. And then fourth is sort of what the next social contract for higher education maybe should look like in terms of the goals that Mark Paul stated, or maybe it was Lee stated earlier, promoting entrepreneurship, risk-taking, long-term economic growth, and something that's citizen-based, not tied to placement. Let me turn back to the first point, though, which is that the federal and state investment in higher education has changed dramatically, and we've gone from the system of public investment to private responsibility. Federal support for higher education over the last 30 years has been relatively constant in inflation-adjusted terms. But the nature of the federal investment in higher education has changed dramatically. About 30 years ago, the typical financial aid package was about 60% grants, 40% loans. Today, the typical financial aid package is about 40% grants and 60% loans. Again, the shift from public investment to private responsibility. Student loan debt has doubled over the last decade. Right now, the average undergraduate is leaving school with approximately $21,000 in student loan debt. That's not counting credit card debt, for example. And when we talk about graduate school, we have people leaving school with 6-figure graduate debt and the 100,000 plus range. The second is that state support for higher education has changed dramatically over the last 30-odd years. And basically, it's dropped. What happens is states go through this cycle, which we're seeing happen right now in California and many, many other states. When the recession hits, state revenue dries up. The states, 49 of whom have balanced budget requirements, respond by cutting funding for higher education. They do this because they know that public colleges and universities can backfill those cuts by raising tuition. This is one of the reasons why we've seen a marked increase in tuition. And they're willing to do this because they know that students can still go because they can borrow student loans. So we have this cycle of state recession, state budget cuts, raising tuition at public colleges and universities, increased student debt. It happened in the 80s, early 80s. It happened a lot at the beginning of this decade, and it's happening now. We're already seeing it. Marked jumps in tuition and fees from one year to the next. University of Arizona in 2003, public college tuition went up 39% in 1 year. And we see this time and time again. I think Pat will probably talk about California. There are talks now about not only increasing tuition at California, but also dramatically reducing enrollment. So the head of the California State University has talked about eliminating 10,000 slots from California State University's enrollment. So federal and state investments changed markedly, and there's been a shift from public investment to private investment. I said the stimulus represents a market increase in federal investment and a potential lasting shift in state investment is my second point. Obviously, the stimulus is still being developed. And having worked for Congress for almost a decade, for both Senators Pell and Kennedy, I can tell you that this stimulus is far from complete. And it's not a slam dunk that it will happen in the next week, next 2 weeks. It takes 60 votes to do anything in the Senate, and one member can slow down the matters a great deal. But nevertheless, in both the House and Senate bill, there's a 50% increase in the three main federal education programs. 50% in Title I, No Child Left Behind funding, a 50% increase in funding for IDEA special education, and a 50% increase in Pell Grant funding over the next 2 years, each year, next 2 years. So it's an extraordinarily larger investment. The House has even more money just going in general aid to states over and above that, and that's in dispute. But nevertheless, for these federal programs, big increases. The Pell Grant maximum is going to go up to in excess of $5,000, $5,300 it looks like. There will be refundable tax credits in the range of $1,800 to $2,500. And just to give you a sense of perspective, public college tuition nationally averages a little over $6,000. So the maximum Pell Grant alone is getting you 85% of the way there, and then you add on these tax benefits. You're basically getting up to the full tuition and fee level at a public college and university, 4-year public college and university nationally. That doesn't count room and board, which adds another, say, 12 grand on average, but nevertheless, a sizable increase. In addition, a sizable increase in student loan borrowing limits. But the big change that isn't getting much attention, that I see from a sort of philosophical perspective that's included in the stimulus, is a maintenance of effort requirement on the states. We require the states to maintain their fiscal effort for transportation spending, for Medicaid spending, for all sorts of spending, but never have we done it for higher education spending at the federal level. And this stimulus requires that the states maintain their fiscal effort for higher education. Which is a big deal because, as I mentioned, over the last 30 years, there's been a 20% drop in state investment for higher education and a corresponding increase in public college tuition at state universities, community colleges. So if the federal government comes in with this hard maintenance of effort, and if it extends it beyond the 2-year period of the stimulus, if we see some sort of shift in the federal-state relationship, well, then that can have dramatic, lasting effects, I think, in terms of this balance between public investment in higher education and private responsibility. Okay, so now we've got, which brings me to my third point, which is sort of the options for an increased public investment in higher education. The first is what Congress and the President basically are doing now in the form of the stimulus, which is dumping money into existing programs. The Pell Grant program, increasing student loan borrowing limits, for example. That's the easiest thing to do because there's a broad base of support for it. It's not necessarily the most effective thing to do or the most efficient thing to do, which maybe Pat will speak about in his remarks or I can discuss later. And don't get me wrong, I worked for Senator Pell for a long time, and I spent many nights working for Senator Kennedy trying to increase the Pell Grant program and make student loans cheaper. We need bigger grants and cheaper loans, as far as I'm concerned. But that doesn't mean it's the most efficient or the most effective method of investment in higher education. There are other things we can do. So what are some of those other things? Number one is we could kind of follow a sort of 90s model of increased public support for private savings. There are 7 million families who have 529 accounts in America, which is named after the provision in the tax code that makes basically saving for college tax-preferred, tax-deferred growth, tax-free earnings. 11 states have established a variety of features to try and make 529 plans more progressive. 529 plans obviously cater to people with upper income because they have disposable income to save. Plus, because we have a marginal tax rate structure, the benefits of tax breaks accrue in largest proportion to those who are upper income. So these other states, these 11 states, Michigan, Colorado, for example, have instituted a variety of features to make their 529 plans more progressive. We could extend that even further. Why not have, for example, every needy 8th grade student or every needy kindergarten student having their own personal college savings plan? They cost like $25 to set up a college savings account, and you could seed it with this increased federal investment that I'm mentioning in the form of Pell Grant aid and so forth. A third option is an improved provision of social insurance for the private risk associated with higher education. When we talk about promoting private savings, I mentioned the very large levels of indebtedness that are coming on. But higher education is a public good as well as a private good. And we tend to neglect that recognition of the public good element. So folks are taking on huge private risks, and often higher education isn't working out for them. The dropout rate for four-year colleges and universities is in excess of 50%. For minorities, it's markedly higher. So what would improved social insurance look like? Well, the government currently has a little-known or little-used program called income contingent repayment for student loans. This was something that President Clinton pushed a great deal in 1992 and 93 when he took office, where people would pay as they earn. They would pay a certain percentage of their income for their student loan to make their student loan payments. So those who earned a lot would pay a lot, and those who didn't earn a lot would pay less, which would presumably encourage people to go into public service and other low-income oriented occupations, which may be in the public interest. It also would protect those who take on huge debt and for whom higher education doesn't work out, who they drop out, for example. It has some negative effects, right? There's a work disincentive. The fourth thing we could do, which is what the states have done, but the feds have not, which is this increased public investment could be directed at institutions. 35 years ago, Senator Pell was developing the Pell Grant. There was a sizable fight in Washington over the nature of federal aid to education. Should it go to the students or should it go to the institutions? And most of the traditional higher education community wanted aid from the federal government to go to the colleges, the institutions, who would then package the aid, they'd look at individual circumstances of students, and they'd provide a package to the student that would help them go. Senator Pell was very committed to aid going directly to the student, irrespective of the institution they went to, other than the cost of attendance to that institution, which is why we have the Pell Grant today. He won that fight. And there are now 7 million Pell Grant recipients. That's been a very effective system in terms of helping kids go to school. It may have had some negative impact in terms of, or let me rephrase, it may reflect a missed opportunity in terms of getting institutions to control their costs. If you're providing big aid to institutions, then you might have a bigger say over how those institutions spend their money and what they do in terms of tuition growth. Now, where should we go among these options? I happen to like all of these options. But where should we go from here in terms of the next social contract for higher education? LEAF, because I was not consulted on the nature of this conference. Unfortunately, the question was posed, is the next social contract for higher education? I really think the question really should be the next social contract for education, because there is a problem, PK through 16. There is a problem in education in that it is, what was a strength has now become a weakness. It is very decentralized, and various sectors operate in silos. Early education operates separately from the demands and expectations of K-12. The K-12 system is entirely separate from the demands and expectations of higher education. To give you one example, students in California, they take a No Child Left Behind test that is theoretically linked to their state standards, expectations of what they should know and be able to do. Then they take the SAT or ACT as an admissions test to higher education, which has no connection to the curriculum for the state of California, or the standards of California. Then they get into an institution of higher education, they take another test, a placement test, and they find out that actually they're not very smart at all, and they have to take a remedial class in high school. So they're now in higher education, learning what they should have learned in high school, but of course higher education never told the high school system, the K-12 system, what their expectations were. And by the way, those students not only incur a larger cost, but they drop out at a markedly higher rate. So to my mind, the next social contract for higher education needs to look like a more integrated, unified, and frankly centralized system. I don't know if the country is ready for that yet, but as there is an increase in public investment at the federal level and potentially stabilized investment at the private level, I think we are setting a stage for marked national reform. Now, ideally, and this comes from my No Child Left Behind experience working with Senator Kennedy, you couple resources and reform, because providing more resources leverages, let's say, acquiescence to some reforms. And by the same token, those who are a little remiss to increase resources for social policies that, or institutions that they don't feel are very effective, the reforms facilitate increase in resources. So really you want to couple the two. At the moment, they are not coupled. And I think that is a reflection of a lack of intellectual work in the broader education policy community when it comes to the next social contract for education. So I'm glad we're doing this conference, and hopefully it will spur a lot more thinking, both in the New America Foundation and far beyond. But let's hear some from Pat Callan on his thinking on, hopefully, California and some of those reforms to couple with those resources, and then we'll turn to a Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. The organization that I represent, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, was founded in the late 1990s, put together at the behest of a group of national foundations, and I guess founded by then Governor of North Carolina Jim Hunt and myself. We happen to be located here in California just because our predecessor organization was a center focused just on California, and so we're located in San Jose. We're an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that has as its mission, one of the presidents of one of the foundations who were responsible for founding this place stuck his finger in my chest and said, I want you to start a public interest higher education policy center. So that doesn't mean we necessarily always get right what the public good is, but it means that our mission is to ask that question first, and we are, so, rather than what is in the interest of institutions, faculty, trustees, governors, legislatures, et cetera. One of the things that we have developed over the last decade has been a biennial report card on higher education called Measuring Up, that using a set of indicators measures, evaluates, and compares and actually grades each state about its performance in higher education, beginning with how well it does getting young people prepared to go to college, how well does each state do getting people, both young people coming out of high school and working adults enrolled, access or participation. How do we do once people are enrolled, getting them to completion of a degree or program, whether it's 2-year or 4-year or an occupational certificate program. How affordable is higher education, and we use the family income in each state and the total cost of going to college when all the financial aid is taken into account at a 2-year public, a 4-year public, or a 4-year private institution. And we have another category called benefits, where we measure some of what we believe are the economic and civic benefits that states get for having an educated population. So I'd like to talk to you a bit today about kind of this, looking at that. Now, that's not graduate education, it's not research, and so there's a big part of this we don't examine, mostly because the country, it seemed to us, already had pretty good indicators and benchmarks for those. So let me talk to you about American higher education and how it performs in these areas and how California fits into all of this. So starting with preparation, the students who graduate from high school today, we can't get into the classroom and look at the curriculum, but we can see that students who graduate tend to have taken the courses that research tells us are correlated with getting into college and succeeding in larger numbers than they did 20 years ago, but also larger numbers don't graduate. And so it's kind of a mixed picture. With respect to access, the country has really been flat for a decade and a half. This is a country that has always prided itself on every generation being better educated than the one before us, and we've made almost no progress. A little blip up one year, a little down another. Completion rates have always been the Achilles heel of American higher education. We've always taken much more satisfaction in getting people in and the access. At the time when we led the world in access, we don't anymore. So we perform pretty mediocre. States that get Bs from us in completion rates, California gets a B minus, partly because it's so selective who gets to get into a baccalaureate granting institution. You have to be in the top third of your high school graduating class to go to a state college, or the top eighth of the university, and our transfer from community colleges to 4 years, as I will get to in a minute, is pretty poor. But so in general, the states that we give fairly high grades to have maybe 2/3, 60–65% graduation rate, among, even in a place like California, fairly selective colleges. Now, obviously, at the higher you go on the selectivity, the higher the completion rate. But when you get to the regional state colleges, the less selective liberal arts colleges, and people who transfer for community college. And then affordability, where the last report card we gave 49 of 50 states Fs. California got a C minus, only because we use these indicators, then we weight them by enrollment. And California is a system which forces most of its students to begin in community colleges, where we've kept it relatively cheap. California has it, but the grade drops every 2 years when we do this, and California has kind of the double problem. Michael referred to a piece of it, not talking about California. That is, we are not terribly expensive on tuition. The University of California is not cheap by comparison, but the California State University is, and so are and the community colleges are the least expensive in the country. But most of our students have to go to college in the highest cost of living areas in the country. And so that's the killer in California, and that's why we have to be more careful about tuition than a lot of other states. So let me now come to California in a slightly different take. The 1960 California Master Plan for Higher Education was one of the great policy innovations in the world in higher education in the second half of the 20th century, and California led the country and the world. Its purpose was basically to provide access to every Californian who could benefit from higher education and wanted to be there. We were the first government anywhere in the world, as Clark Kerr used to remind us, to make that commitment. And then, in order to keep it, we had to have a very disciplined system. We could not afford to tell everyone they could go to Berkeley or Stanford. So we divided the public sector up into three systems: a community college, which was open admissions, a state university, which takes the top third of high school graduates, and University of California, the top eighth. And the idea was anyone in California could start in one of those community colleges and transfer to a four-year institution, get a baccalaureate degree, so that even if you weren't able to do it, either for financial reasons, you had to live at home or something, or academic reasons, you could start and go on. And then we provided financial aid that allowed some students to choose private colleges and universities. For about 20 years, that system was sort of the world leader. We were, as I say, first like the country was in almost everything, everything you could measure. And that performance has steadily declined over the past 25 years, and I would say for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't quite agree with Michael about either the role that the federal government should play in all this or the underfunding of higher education. The problem is that it's a very volatile pattern, and it's exactly the way he described it. That higher education in this state has done better than most of the rest of state-funded enterprises in good times and worse in bad times. And our approach to bad times, we're the only state that does this, has been to ruthlessly cut enrollments. So in the early recession of the early 80s, partly because of the recession and partly because of a political fight about tuition in the community colleges, we cut enrollments by 270,000 in the community colleges. In the early 90s, we cut about 150,000 out of the state university and 50,000 out of the community colleges and 50,000 out of the state university. And early in this decade, we cut again the community colleges. And we do a lot of other things other than overt cuts, like manipulating application deadlines, so students who don't have, which we're doing now, so students who don't have good high school counseling and whatnot are excluded. And the University of California has never, it's now announced, as Michael said, that it does intend to not take qualified students next year, but in general it's been able to manage this problem by simply having a campus or two that's very unattractive. That will never, they'll use this campus out in Merced this time, so they'll officially cut about 2,500 students according to the plan, but they'll be able to say they kept their commitment and offered everyone a chance. And we've just never been any good at getting students to do what the educational planners thought they should. So somebody from San Mateo applies to Berkeley, doesn't get in, they find out they can go to Riverside, but they enroll in San Francisco State, and that sort of students make their own decisions. As I recently looked at the consequences of some of the enrollment reductions that we've undergone in California. So in the early 90s, when we had the huge cuts out of the state university and the community colleges, the budgets came back in about 3 years, but it took 7 or 8 years for the enrollment levels to get to where they had been. So what happens, I think, is that these first-generation college students, their aspirations are quite fragile, and if either they can't afford it, or if there's no space for them because we're cutting capacity in the year they graduate, they don't hang around and wait for us to let them in or offer the class. So, that's part of the reason that California is no longer the leader that it once was in higher education access. Our transfer rates are dismal. We have about, this was supposed to be the way anyone could get to a baccalaureate degree. In 2007, I think we have 2 million students in the community colleges, many of whom have no intention or interest in transferring, but only 70,000 actually transferred to the University of California or the state university. And the state does spend about $8 billion a year on higher education, not a paltry sum, but we have tended to overinvest in what I'd call the high end. That is, you heard about our public school funding a little while ago. Well, average per student funding in the community colleges is half of what it is in the public schools. On the other hand, we continue to expand the research sector at a very, very high cost. The advice our organization gives every state is if you have to grow and if you have high-quality research universities, keep your focus on those places and maintaining the quality. Do not erode that investment across a whole lot of places. If you've got to take undergraduate students, why would you pay 4 times the amount per student to send them to a research university to buy, in addition to the undergraduates, all the graduate education and research, for which there is no demonstrable need for all of those programs. California's problem, as it is with half a dozen other states, is finding good quality educational opportunities for a growing young population that is first generation, heavily Latino, et cetera. It isn't building research universities in the middle of nowhere, which is UC Merced, at a very, very high cost. And so, to some extent, the funding problems that we're facing now, I have great sympathy, having been through these kinds of eras myself. And when I worked in higher education here and in Washington and in Montana, but to some extent, we have a case of a sort of allocational inefficiencies. That is, we are not putting our investment where the public needs are. And in the midst of that, we have this huge demographic shift that I don't have to remind you of. If you look at public school enrollment from the 12th grade down to kindergarten, every year there's fewer people who look like me and more of the people with whom our higher education system and our K-12 system are doing the least well. And so what we have is, in a sense, the American problem writ large. You know, for years, even the harshest critics of American higher education have always said, we are the best in the world, and then 3 or 4 pages later, you're supposed to get to the first but. The commission that Margaret Spellings appointed didn't do that, and even though its recommendations, I don't think, were particularly onerous, that the fact that it didn't genuflect in that direction caused it, a couple of years ago, enormous difficulties with the higher education community, which often seems more interested in deference than it does in policy. But the truth of the matter is, we still have a disproportionate share of the great universities and colleges of all kinds in the world, as Americans and as Californians. But if being the best of the world means you're doing the best job of educating people, every time the international comparisons come out. Now, I'm old enough that throughout most of my career, the United States has been #1 in the world in almost everything you could measure, as I said earlier. But we're dropping, just in the OECD measures, which still don't look at India and China, we've dropped every time we drop a couple notches to 9th or 10th in access. We're somewhere near the middle of the bottom 10. We've always been laggards in completion. And the place where what's happening to this state and this country really shows is we're still in educational attainment, the proportion of the population that has college degrees. We're still second in the world. Okay, Canada, I think, has more than we do. But if you look at the population 25 to 35, the young workforce of the country, we're one of a handful of countries in which our older population, those who are moving steadily towards retirement, is better educated than our young population. And California is behind the national average on that. So you can see the consequences of this lack of progress we've made on access when you look at the last 15 years. The truth is, we're not doing any worse than we were doing in 1990. But the rest of the world has been less complacent. I mean, they've caught on that this is about, yes, it's about individual opportunity, but it's also about the ability to be competitive in a knowledge-based world economy. And so countries that used to really lag us, Great Britain, once the most elitist system of higher education in the world, just now right behind us. Countries that used to really lag us in the 90s and in this decade have caught up and surpassed us, and that means that the educational strength of those populations, of those countries, which are also competitors — I mean, we like to see education improving all over the world, but they're also economic competitors — is in their young population, which is going to be in the workforce for decades to come. And ours is in the 78 million baby boomers, the best educated Americans in history, who, even if they stick around a while because of this horrid economy and what it's done to their portfolio, their retirement, even the baby boomers are mortal. So our educational strength is in our older population, and in much of the rest of the world, it's in the younger population. So in a sense, the problem is, in terms of a social compact, in a sense, in some ways, as I've heard people talk about policy failures all over the place today, I'm thinking, this may be a worse problem. We had the most successful public policy that created the most successful public policy system in the world, and it may be harder to change something that is successful and is no longer relevant to the population we have now. This is a system we built at a time of expansion and of great expansiveness in the public sector. It's a system we built for a population that was a relatively white, homogeneous, middle-class baby boomers, and it simply is failing to deliver. So both analysis that we've done with the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems and the Public Policy Institute here in San Francisco has warned California that it's going to have, as these baby boomers retire, the danger of it. Nobody knows how many good jobs there will be out there in the workforce or where they'll be, but I don't know anyone that would argue this is a precipitous time for either California or the country to see a decrease in educational attainment. Yet that's exactly the direction that we're going in. So and if the correlation between education and income were to stay the same, according to our projections, you'd have an actual decline in the standard of living in California by 2020. That's not a prediction. That's just a worst-case scenario. So, the California, like the country, has to deal with we have the best 20th century system of higher education in the world, in the United States, and California is the best of those. But we really have got to redesign this system, got to make it more cost-effective. We simply will not be able to educate them at the current cost trajectory, whether you count all the sources of income for education, tuition, state appropriations, federal. If you look at the gap we'd have to fill to replace the baby boomers and then to compete with some of the countries that are doing better than us, you can have the most optimistic view in the world of what happens to the future of the American economy and the generosity of Congress and state legislatures towards higher education. There will not be enough money to fill that unless we can sort of control that cost trajectory. So for students, we just released, some of you may have seen it, got a lot of attention around the country, a set of public opinion, some public opinion research we did in December, watching the growing public alarm about access and affordability and belief that a lot of people who are qualified aren't getting college opportunity. High levels of anxiety about the level of debt. Most Americans believe it's okay for people to work and borrow a little to go to college, but there is a sense that this thing is sort of out of out of control. So everywhere you go in the country and the world, the higher education community says, well, we wouldn't do this if we just get more money from government. And yet the state government scenario, excuse me, Michael, isn't as bad as I think Michael's view of it is. We add about $10 billion a year nationally to state appropriations for higher education. We don't have a measure of adequacy. I don't know if that's enough or not, but it seems to me we do have issues about having prepared for the least affluent, most heterogeneous population to come to the doorsteps of American higher education by raising prices. We also have a lot of loan aversion in these populations. If your experience of no one in your family or your neighborhood has ever experienced the economic benefits of college, and what you know about borrowing is the people down the street borrowed $2,500 for furniture, somebody lost their job, and 3 weeks later there was a truck at their front door, it doesn't exactly make you excited about the possibility of borrowing large of money for going to college. And to some extent, people have been talking about this loan aversion as, man, if we could just get these people to wise up like the rest of us. Well, maybe we'll be wanting to wise up like some of them. A lot of people are upside down on home equity loans, a lot of middle-class families, et cetera. So we really need a conversation about the higher education system of the 21st century. It needs to happen at the state and federal level. I don't think it should be dictated by the federal government, and I don't think the new social contract ought to be between, we have a large, complex higher education system with public and private, all kinds of systems of governance that have produced, for a while at least, the best system of higher education in the world. And the federal government has played a relatively limited role. It would be a shame, as Michael pointed out, if we, because of the need for the stimulus package or whatever, if that money comes to us in a way that reinforces the current programs, reinforces the status quo, and keeps us from having to have this conversation about federal and state roles, about how much higher education we should ask students and families to pay for, and how much borrowing and how much work, and what students and what institutions. And we really haven't had that conversation since the discussion that Michael described that happened in the early 70s when Clark Kerr from here in California was stood alone in the higher education community and was subject to great vitriol for supporting the notion that the federal government should support student aid and not colleges and universities directly, believing that the student market, the best financial aid was that which came to students and let them make their own choices, and that the federal government would get heavily intrusive in both public and private education if we provided direct support to institutions. But all those questions need to be opened up again. One key to opening it up is getting off of the idea, either in California or the country, that we're the best in the world. The good news is we have a very strong foundation in what we did with the veterans, the baby boomers, and then the civil rights movement. We didn't do it all right. We left some people behind, but we did build a foundation. We don't have to go back in California and build 140 or 50 public colleges and universities. We have all that, but we have a lot of complacency to overcome and a lot of hard thinking to do, because it's very clear year by year that clinging to this policy structure that served us so well from about 1960 to 1985 what we're seeing is a steady erosion, a danger of eroding on every front, on research because we're overextended, and on access because we're not allocating our resources in smart ways given the population that we have to serve now. So we have a big agenda in front of us. The short-term problem is going to be damage control. That is, how do we keep budget cuts from freezing people out of higher education completely? And there's very little indication, with everybody announcing what they're going to do when they get cut, that there's any coming together among the three public sectors and the private to really think about how we could collectively insulate our students. You know, the worst thing is not to go to Berkeley. The worst thing is not to go to college. And it seems to me we ought to be thinking collaboratively about jointly admitting students into the community colleges so they can seamlessly transfer and things like that, so that we don't exacerbate the problem of both individual opportunity, but also the problem of the state's long-term economic competitiveness. So we have a great history and a big agenda. We sort of have the intellectual firepower in higher education in California and the country, as well as in the state legislatures, I would argue, and in Washington to address these issues. Our problem doesn't seem to be so much that we have the great debates and the bad guys win and the good guys lose, but we really never get the problems that are core to the future of both higher education and the country and the states out on the table, and that's the first challenge, I think. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Pat a couple of questions and then turn it over to the audience quickly. Pat, hopefully an area where maybe we can come to agreement is I had said that there's been a decline in the state investment for higher education, and you had disagreed with that. Maybe we can agree that there's been an increase in the state investment for higher education, but as a proportion of college revenues, that the state investment has declined. Now, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but regardless of whether you agree with it or not.
It's a fact.
Yeah. But regardless of whether you agree with it or not, my question is that poll after poll, and the most recent one is the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Gallup poll did recently released a poll on Americans' concerns with higher education, and ranking is extremely important. Concentration of wealth amongst institutions was last. Next was access for low-income students. Next, highest, was quality of institutions. And the number one issue in higher education for the family's rank is extremely important. 44% said it was tuition and controlling college costs. And what was most interesting about that was that, as you would maybe not be surprised, it was particularly true in the Northeast, where there are a lot of private colleges, and less so in the West. But regardless, I visit politicians all the time who say to me, what can you do? What can you tell me that we can do about tuition, out of control tuition? I never have a good answer. What's your answer?
Well, I think what happens, first of all, the reason that that state appropriations are a smaller portion of college budgets is largely because they've raised tuition so much and because they've done a lot of private fundraising. So this isn't entirely, college universities aren't exactly victims necessarily in this scenario. So what we've had going on the last 15 years, last year we graduated the biggest high school graduating class in the history of the country, and we have an economy that's basically tells every student, and when we've done polls and focus groups, as have others with high school kids, that without some education or training beyond high school, if you count higher ed as that, education or training beyond high school, you can't get into the middle class. So what's happened is it's been a seller's market for higher education, and higher education has exploited that market. If you look at the state appropriations for higher education, even in years when we had average increases across the country of 6 or 7%, that's where this decade is unlike previous decades. Tuition has gone up faster than family income and faster than inflation. So it is no wonder that when people are, in the past polling, and we've been doing public opinion research for about 15 years on these issues, and so in the past people have used have believed, as they once did about health care, that if you have access to higher education, you have access to something very good, but they're very concerned about access for themselves, their kids, their grandkids, et cetera. Now we're starting to see in the last set of public opinion research we did with both the general public and with parents around the country, people are starting to question value. I mean, they're starting to say they don't believe that it's worth it anymore. They're paying more. And so my sense is the affordability problem is an issue that we have to deal with, but we can't deal with it by simply constraining tuition. That's what they do here in California and some other states. That is, in bad economies, they raise tuition precipitously. When unemployment is high, personal income isn't growing, and even part-time jobs are hard to find, that's when tuition goes up. But the people of the state don't like it, and so politicians go out and they start to get criticism for that. And so then, just when the economy starts to improve, and people could afford to pay a little more, we freeze it for 2 or 3 years. And then, lo and behold, we get into another recession, and people say, well, those students, we haven't touched them for a long time. So the bad thing to be in California is the worst thing you can do in California if you're planning your life or that of your kids and you're interested in education is to graduate from high school in a year when the economy's down, because you're going to get the tuition increases that the whole last generation would have done if we'd had sensible policy. And of course, at the same time, as Governor Schwarzenegger has suggested again, the first year of every recession, we tend to cut financial aid programs while we're raising tuition because we do across-the-board cuts in state. So nobody understands it. For the student, that's a double hit. You know, but it's just doing this in a kind of mechanistic sort of way. So I think we have to deal with the affordability problem. The favorite of the higher education leadership of the associations that you and I have dealt with a lot, their preferred approach to dealing with affordability is you rely entirely on financial aid. But the truth is, as the Spellings question pointed out, we're on a national treadmill. We are investing more in aid. We're certainly doing it here in California than we ever did before. But the prices and costs keep going up faster, so we keep getting further and further behind. So there's no solution to this that doesn't somehow try to influence that cost trajectory. I don't believe. And so, so we have to think about a cost-effective higher education, and part of it, and somewhat the easiest part, is don't try to have 10 research universities. Don't, you know, I just read a piece, I think it'd be all right since I'm on the other end of the country to talk about, but Bob Graham, the former senator from Florida, just sent me a draft of an op-ed piece he'd written. He upset because the governor down there has just proposed allowing colleges to raise tuition 15%. He wanted me to look at it because he'd cited some of our data. But what he pointed out is, look, when we think things are pretty good, we let every university establish research and graduate programs for the sake of its own prestige that aren't needed. We start law schools, Irvine, medical schools that we don't need, both talking about that at both Riverside and Merced, right? And then the budget constricts and we say, we can't afford all this higher education. Let's stick it to the undergraduates. They need a good tuition increase to help us pay for this. So we're in a cycle. Part of it is because it is such a status-driven system and that much of the public and the political leadership has historically bought into the higher education view of communities' view of all that. And you can't blame these communities. I mean, if someone offered to start a research university across the street from my house at all the rest of your expense, I would certainly support that idea. But so I think it's naive. The states have been naive often, and I really hope the stimulus package doesn't push us in this direction by believing that you could, as some states are doing now, Maryland, buy down the tuition increase. Maryland will be in its 4th year of that, after, by the way, in all fairness, a decade of really, really steep increases. That you could buy down the tuition increase, that is, just give the universities the money and colleges they would have gotten otherwise, and thereby freeze tuition. And that's what we've done in California from time to time. But sooner or later, the day comes when you can't afford that buy down. So you're not controlling the cost, you're only controlling the price. And that over time, that bill will come due, and the students who happen to be in college at that time will get a disproportionate share of it, I would argue. So what we need is some kind of policy about tuition and affordability. We need, in the states, we need a policy-driven system which will assure that increases are moderate, gradual, predictable, accompanied by student financial aid. We have no discipline because we've used tuition as the safety valve. And that, to give one more point, Michael, and then that I think has been, so what happens in higher education, it happens here and it happens in other states, is you don't see college universities mobilizing the way the public schools, the social workers, and the prison guards do to stop precipitous state budget cuts, even though God knows we've gotten our share and more. When college university leaders who feel their first responsibility is to assure adequate funding for the institution see a cut coming, they start negotiating with the state for tuition. And so we never really have and if you ask them, well, we don't have the political clout, well, that's an untested hypothesis. In most states, we probably have more political clout than we think we do as people around, especially as this affordability issue jumps out in all of the polls. It's now part of this cluster of economic anxieties about health care and employment and retirement that has a knot in the stomach of a big chunk of middle class and lower income Americans.
Okay, I have other questions, but we're running short on time, and I want the audience to have an opportunity. So if you don't ask questions, you're going to get stuck hearing my questions. So please raise your hands if you have questions. Why don't we start with you here in the front? Yeah. Do you need to wait for the microphone?
Yes, please.
Right to your right.
So there's been some statistics published about the portion of cost increase that comes from administrative costs, and the point's been made that administrative costs at many colleges and universities have gone up disproportionately relative to costs directly related to faculty and other education. I'm wondering, First of all, do you agree with that assessment? And second of all, if there is a dynamic like that, what is the obligation on the universities and colleges to change their own cost structure, as part of the broader solutions of increasing revenue, whether from state or federal?
There's some very good work that has been done, a lot of it in the last couple of years by my colleague Jane Wellman at something called the Delta Project, trying to look at expenditures, and it has shown just what you said. The trouble, what they've shown is that instructional expenditures have not grown and non-instructional expenditures have. It's a little bit scary because I'm not sure when you look underneath all that. I look at the California state colleges or the community colleges. Non-instructional expenses often include student support services that the students we're serving, whether it's tutorial or childcare or whatever, absolutely need to stay in school. I mean, a lot of them could get the content probably on the internet, but they have to have these other things. And so I'm a little worried. In California, we have a tradition of passing laws requiring institutions to spend a certain half of their budget, I think, in community colleges on instruction, which supports this traditional model. The other thing, a lot of the money is going for, I think, is fundraising. So, it wasn't that long ago, 3 decades ago, the public universities weren't much in that business. I mean, these California state university systems didn't even have campuses, even some of the old ones didn't even have lists of their alumni. The implicit deal was we let the privates get their money from the private, and we get ours from the legislature. Well, that obviously isn't the case anymore. So I think we have to be very aware of costs. I think we have to look for the dirty word that is, the productivity increases on both the academic and the non-academic side of the house. I think we have underutilized, as some work that's been done by Carol Twigg and others showed, the possibility of using hybrid systems of interactive technology and lectures and labs that in the long run save money, and they've done all this with control groups that show that student learning is the same or better in these circumstances. So the productivity issue has got to be high on the agenda. The other thing that's really a dilemma, because most of us don't want to, at least right at the moment, take out against tenure, but higher education is one of the few enterprises, when you get in a tough economy, what do? We get rid of the cheapest, the faculty we pay the least to teach most of the undergraduates in our big complex places, so the expenditure per student goes up. And then we say we have to cut the number of students. Yeah, so we're kind of hoist on our own petard in some of these.
Of course, the tenure issue also extends to K-12 education, and in both cases, it's not just the least experienced faculty, but sometimes the most effective faculty are the ones who are dismissed earliest. Let's move to another question. Please keep your question short, otherwise I will cut you off if you speechify. There in the back.
Hi, my name is Diana Dwyer. I teach political science at Chico State. And over the last 11 years, I've seen our student population get wider and richer. And I've seen my class sizes go up, and spending on many things that are obviously questionable also go up, while there are fewer resources for students. I am intrigued by your idea of focusing on how we spend our money rather than where it's coming from, particularly between the UCs and the CSUs here in California. And I'm wondering, how politically possible do you think this sort of rethinking of the high-end spending, where we're training more PhDs than there are jobs for, and granting the new charters to places like UC Merced?
Whatever.
We'll both chime in, since I spent a lot of years in politics. The Community College Association and state universities struck me in my time in Washington as always in need of a dramatic improvement. It was shocking to me that they were not more politically powerful. Because 75% of all students are going to these institutions, the community colleges in particular have a great story to tell in terms of socioeconomic diversity and linkages with economic development. But as Pat indicated, and your question indicates, state legislators and governors in particular pay a great deal of attention to the flagship universities, which get a disproportionate amount of funding. That is not just true when it comes to support for instructional resources, but also athletic facilities and non-instructional resources, because those flagship universities tend to have the best athletic teams, and a very, very active alumni association. So when you ask how politically possible is it, my reaction as a former political hack is, physician, heal thyself. I mean, the institutions have to be better advocates in telling their story and also in reaching out to the media, which is where I wanted to, my last point on this, which is not only are the politicians very responsive to the flagship universities where they went, where there are elite athletic programs, but so is major media, because reporters, editors either went to these upper income elite institutions, or they want to send their children to these elite institutions. So that's where they focus their time and attention, and not where the great masses go. But the story is out there. So is it politically feasible? Yes, if that community is more mobilized, mobilized politically.
Let me give you a couple. It's very difficult. Americans tend to love higher education, and it looks like there's some disillusionment setting in. But so the tendency is to think that if something is good, more of anything is better, and that's not necessarily true. The California Master Plan largely came about because of the the legislature was starting to place institutions in places where there were no students, in the sense that we were going to spend a fortune and still not meet our educational needs. And so the need to do this efficiently is very important. At the state level, we could, Illinois in the late 90s did a kind of a very, I think, effective sort of cleanup. You have to do this every few years. And what it did was it didn't try to collect all the proceeds of programs that were cut. It said you can use this money to improve quality of the things you really think are important in some cases. Maryland, the Maryland system of higher education, just gone through a major, and continues to go through a major look at its productivity and efficiency. And as a consequence, in both Maryland in the 90s, in this decade, and Illinois in the last decade, after that was done, and they could make the argument that we indeed are efficient, they got significant increases in appropriation. So I think this is an agenda we have to do. The other thing, and I don't have a political strategy like the one Michael has outlined, but I do think he's right that we have got to create, because if you look at the needs of the country, it isn't that we don't need great research universities, we absolutely do, but in terms of the kind of development of human talent or human capital, it is the broad access institutions that are going to be critical. And so we have this huge fight about rationing spaces in the elite places, whether it's about admissions or affirmative action or whatever else. At the end of the day, the big difference in America is not between people who go to a flagship university and people who don't. It's between people who go to college and people who don't. And the vast majority of these next generation, like the previous generations in California and other states, will go to community colleges and CSU colleges and will get well educated and will be highly functional in the workforce. I remember a piece Nick Lemon did in the Washington Monthly in the late 90s showing that no matter how you controlled for size, the regional state college universities, there were more Fortune 500 CEOs who had come out of those than out of the Ivy League or the elites, which only account for a small percent, but as Michael pointed out, it really do tend to mesmerize the media and public attention, but I think there is a job of sort of making ourselves efficient so we can argue effective, so we're spending our money where the public's needs are, and we can make a much better case that we're a suitable place for public investment because we're using our resources in the ways that really make a difference. But that means a kind of broad public interest perspective prevailing over a parochial perspective, because as you well know, there's no faculty that doesn't think its programs are the ones that are either now or in the future going to carry the state on its shoulders.
Thank you, Pat. We are going to be available to answer a lot more questions after the break. I'm sorry we've run out of time. I apologize for cutting off questions, but please speak to us afterwards. Pat, thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.